Road trips are supposed to be fun and full of adventure, but these 5 scary stories show how quickly things can go wrong. A simple shortcut can lead to creepy encounters that will haunt you forever. From strange hitchhikers and shadowy figures in the woods to mysterious convoys that disappear, these stories will make you think twice about lonely roads and late-night drives. If you've ever thought about taking the scenic route, these chilling tales might make you change your mind. I thought I was safe once I reached the gas station, but I didn't expect someone to follow me back onto the highway. It had been a long drive, 7 hours down lonely back roads, with nothing but the occasional streetlight and the hum of my car's engine for company. I was halfway to my destination, exhausted but determined to push through. When my gas gauge dipped into the red, I pulled off at the first station I could find. It was one of those small, run-down places you only see in the middle of nowhere, the kind with flickering neon signs, a single pump, and an old convenience store that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The pump didn't have a card reader, so I had to go inside to pay. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped into the dimly lit shop, the smell of stale coffee and motor oil hitting me immediately. A man stood behind the counter, staring at a tiny television mounted to the wall. He looked up when I walked in, giving me a quick nod before going back to whatever he was watching. I grabbed a soda and a bag of chips to justify being there and placed them on the counter. "That all for you?" he asked, barely glancing at me. Yeah, and 20 on pump 1, I replied, handing him a bill. As he rang me up, the door jingled again. Another man walked in, his heavy boots thudding against the tile floor. He was tall, with unkempt hair and a grease-stained jacket that hung loosely over his frame. His eyes locked on me immediately, a crooked smile spreading across his face. "Long drive?" he asked casually, leaning against the counter. I hesitated, my instinct telling me to keep the conversation short. "Yeah, something like that," I muttered, trying to focus on the cashier. "Where are you headed?" the man pressed. I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed my receipt and started toward the door, but he wasn't done. "Careful out there," he called after me. "Lots of interesting folks on the road at this hour." The way he said "interesting" sent a chill down my spine. I quickened my pace, stepping back into the cool night air and locking my car doors as soon as I got inside. The unease stayed with me as I pulled out of the station and back onto the highway. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to fatigue and the general creepiness of the gas station. But then, in my rearview mirror, I saw it. Headlights. At first, I thought it was just another driver heading the same direction, but as the minutes ticked by, the car didn't pass me. It stayed behind me, close enough that I could see it was an old pickup truck, its paint chipped and its high beams glaring in my mirror. I switched lanes, hoping the truck would pass, but it didn't. Instead, it swerved into the same lane, its headlights flashing once, then twice. My pulse quickened. I sped up, hoping to put some distance between us, but the truck matched my speed. The driver began honking, the sound blaring through the quiet night. I glanced in the mirror again and saw him, just a shadowy figure behind the wheel, leaning forward like he was studying me. Panic began to set in. The highway was empty, no other cars in sight, and the truck was relentless. It swerved closer to my bumper, its headlights flooding my car with harsh, white light. I fumbled for my phone, but my hands were shaking so badly that I dropped it onto the passenger seat. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I couldn't stop. There was no telling what this guy would do. Up ahead, I spotted a rest stop sign. Without thinking, I veered toward the exit, hoping the truck wouldn't follow. It did. The rest stop was empty, just a single row of parking spaces and a bathroom building illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights. I pulled into a spot near the far end, my tires screeching against the pavement. The truck pulled in behind me, blocking me in. My heart was pounding as I watched the driver's door open. The man from the gas station stepped out, his silhouette towering in the dim light. He was holding something in his hand, a long metal object that glinted ominously. I didn't wait to see what he wanted. I threw my car into reverse, slamming on the gas and narrowly missing the truck as I swerved back onto the highway. The tires screeched as I sped away, my heart racing so hard it felt like it might burst. In the mirror, I saw him standing by his truck, watching me disappear into the night. I didn't stop driving until I reached a motel an hour later. I parked near the office, under the brightest light I could find, and sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to calm down. The next morning, I told the clerk at the front desk about what had happened. He gave me a grim look and said, "You're lucky. That stretch of highway has a reputation. People go missing out there all the time. I never took that route again, and to this day, I can't stop wondering what would have happened if I hadn't sped off. Who was he, and why was he following me? I'll probably never know." It's not unusual to see hitchhikers on lonely highways, but this one wasn't looking for a ride. I was driving home from a friend's cabin late at night, winding through endless stretches of empty highway. The road was flanked by dense trees, their shadows stretching and contorting in the glow of my headlights. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, every hum of the engine amplifying the eerie stillness around me. I rounded a bend, and that's when I saw him. He was standing on the shoulder, one arm hanging limp at his side, while the other clutched a small bag. He wasn't waving or signaling for a ride, just standing there, motionless, staring blankly at the road ahead. Something about him seemed off. His clothes looked old-fashioned, like something from the 1950s. A neatly pressed shirt, high-waisted trousers, and polished shoes that glinted faintly in the moonlight. His hair was slicked back, and his face was pale, almost unnaturally so. But it was his expression that truly unsettled me. He was smiling. Not the warm, friendly kind of smile, but something else. Stiff, unnatural, like it had been forced onto his face. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. As I passed, I tried to get a better look, but his eyes didn't follow my car. He just kept staring straight ahead, that eerie smile frozen on his face. My stomach churned as I gripped the steering wheel tighter, telling myself it was nothing. Just a guy trying to hitch a ride, right? But then I saw him again. I'd driven maybe 2 or 3 miles when I spotted him up ahead, standing in almost the exact same position on the side of the road, the same stiff posture, the same unnerving smile. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. How had he gotten here? There was no way he could have walked this far, this fast. I stared at him for a moment, debating whether to turn around or keep going. Then he turned his head, slowly, and looked right at me. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I hit the gas and sped past him, refusing to look in my rearview mirror. I kept driving, my mind racing with questions. Had I imagined it? Was it some kind of prank? But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, the unease lingered, wrapping around me like a cold fog. The road stretched on endlessly, and the darkness seemed to grow heavier with every mile. I turned on the radio, hoping to drown out the silence, but all I got was static. That's when I saw him again. This time, he was in my rearview mirror, standing in the middle of the road. His face was illuminated by my taillights, that same haunting smile etched into his features. I nearly swerved off the road as panic surged through me. How was this possible? I drove faster, my foot pressing harder on the gas pedal. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to put as much distance as possible between myself and that man, or whatever he was. But the faster I drove, the closer he seemed to get. I'd catch glimpses of him in the distance sometimes, on the side of the road, other times in the mirror. Each time, his expression remained the same, as if he were mocking me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled over, skidding to a stop on the shoulder. Stepping out of the car, I scanned the road behind me. It was empty. The night was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears and made you question your own breathing. There was no sign of the hitchhiker, no footprints, no movement, just the endless expanse of dark asphalt stretching into the night. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to get back in the car or keep looking. That's when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing in the middle of the road just a few feet from my car, was the hitchhiker. His smile was wider now, stretching unnaturally across his face. His eyes, black and hollow, seemed to bore into me, freezing me in place. I don't remember making the decision to run, but the next thing I knew, I was back in the driver's seat, slamming the door and fumbling with the keys. As the engine roared to life, I glanced up, and he was gone. The rest of the drive was a blur. I didn't stop, didn't slow down, and didn't look back. By the time I reached my driveway, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. I sat in the car for a while, trying to calm my racing heart. Eventually, I convinced myself it was over. But it wasn't. 3 days later, I found muddy footprints leading up to my front door. The strange part? They started in the middle of my lawn, as if someone had appeared out of nowhere. The footprints stopped just outside my door, but there were none leading away. That same night, I heard a faint tapping on my bedroom window. When I mustered the courage to look, there was nothing there, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see his smile. What would you do if you saw the same person in multiple places on the same road? I'd always heard stories about strange things happening on long stretches of desert highways, but I never thought I'd be part of one. I was driving through the Mojave late at night, a route I'd taken dozens of times before. The desert had a way of feeling endless, with its barren landscapes stretching out under a sea of stars. It was peaceful in its own way, but also unnervingly empty. I was about 3 hours from my destination when I first saw the convoy. 3 black SUVs, sleek and identical, sped past me in the opposite direction. Their windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside, and they moved in perfect unison, their engines humming like a distant thunderstorm. Something about them felt wrong. Maybe it was the way they seemed out of place, too pristine and deliberate for a lonely desert highway. But I shook it off and kept driving, chalking it up to fatigue. About 20 minutes later, I saw them again. This time, they were parked on the shoulder, their headlights off. As I approached, I noticed the drivers standing outside their vehicles, all facing the road. No, not the road. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I passed. The drivers were all wearing dark suits, their faces partially obscured by shadows. But their eyes followed me. I glanced in my rearview mirror, my stomach twisting in knots. They didn't move, just stood there watching as I disappeared into the night. The unease lingered, growing heavier with each mile. The desert was supposed to be silent, but now it felt oppressive, as if the stillness itself was closing in on me. Then I saw their headlights again. They were behind me now, far enough back that I couldn't make out the details of the vehicles, but close enough to know it was them. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe they'd turned around after I passed them. Maybe they were headed to the same destination. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the pit in my stomach wouldn't go away. When I sped up, so did they. When I slowed down, they matched my pace. By now, my heart was pounding. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 2:14 a.m. The road was empty except for us, an endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the desert. Suddenly, their headlights disappeared. I blinked, gripping the wheel tighter. They were there 1 second, and then nothing. No taillights, no sign of their engines, just an expanse of empty highway behind me. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Less than a minute later, they reappeared, this time ahead of me. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the pavement. The convoy was parked across both lanes, blocking the road. Their headlights were off, their dark silhouettes barely visible in the moonlight. My first instinct was to reverse and get as far away as possible, but before I could, the SUV's engines roared to life. The convoy started moving toward me, slowly and deliberately. Panic surged through me as I threw the car into reverse, my hands trembling. I had no idea where to go. There were no side roads, no landmarks, nothing but endless desert on either side. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted a faint dirt road branching off to the left. Without thinking, I swerved toward it, my car bouncing violently as I hit the uneven terrain. The headlights disappeared again. For a moment, I thought I'd lost them. The dirt road was rough and narrow, winding through a dry wash that seemed to go on forever. But then I heard it, the hum of engines. They were behind me again. The dirt road ended abruptly in a wide, open clearing. I slammed on the brakes, dust swirling around me as I came to a stop. The engines grew louder, and one by one the SUVs appeared, surrounding me in a perfect circle. Their headlights were blinding, cutting through the dust like searchlights. I couldn't see the drivers, but I could feel their presence, oppressive and unrelenting. The hum of their engines was deafening, a low mechanical growl that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, my mind racing. What did they want? Why hadn't they gotten out? For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. The SUVs stayed where they were, their lights trained on me, their engines idling like a predator toying with its prey. Then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, they were gone. The headlights blinked out, leaving me in total darkness. My ears rang in the sudden silence as I sat there, too stunned to move. When I finally mustered the courage to look around, the clearing was empty. No tracks, no dust, nothing to indicate they'd ever been there. Shaking, I turned the car around and drove back the way I came. It took hours to find the highway again, and by the time I did, the first hints of dawn were breaking over the horizon. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, not at first. Who would believe me? But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been part of something otherworldly. Even now, I avoid that stretch of highway. And whenever I see a black SUV, my chest tightens, and I wonder if they're watching, waiting. The GPS told me to take the scenic route through the mountains. It didn't mention the tunnel. It had been a long day of driving, and I was eager to get to my destination before midnight. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in hues of deep purple and grey. I was following the GPS instructions faithfully, even when it rerouted me down a narrow, winding road that seemed to lead deeper into the mountains. I didn't think much of it at first. Scenic routes were often like this, quiet, isolated, and oddly beautiful. But when the road curved sharply and revealed the mouth of a tunnel, I hesitated. It wasn't on the map. The entrance was old and crumbling, its edges overgrown with moss and weeds. There were no lights, no signs, just a gaping black hole carved into the rock. My GPS insisted it was the correct path, but something about it felt wrong. Still, I was tired, and the thought of backtracking for hours wasn't appealing. I took a deep breath, turned on my high beams, and entered the tunnel. The darkness swallowed me whole. My headlights barely cut through the thick, suffocating blackness, illuminating only a few feet of damp stone walls. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for a single car, and the ceiling was so low I felt like I could reach up and touch it. Almost immediately, my radio cut out, replaced by a low hum of static. I reached for my phone to check the map, but there was no signal. The screen displayed a single word: searching. The hum of my engine echoed off the walls, the sound bouncing back at me in distorted, disorienting waves. I gripped the wheel tighter, forcing myself to focus on the road ahead. That's when I heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind. The sound was faint, like a soft murmur, just beyond the edge of hearing. But as I drove deeper into the tunnel, it grew louder. It wasn't the wind. The whispers were low and overlapping, a chorus of voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, above me, beside me, even from the back seat. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone sitting there, but the back seat was empty. I kept driving, my heart pounding in my chest. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, far longer than it should have. My high beams caught glimpses of strange markings on the walls, symbols etched into the stone that I didn't recognize. Then I saw the shadow. It flitted across the edge of my headlights, quick and darting, like something or someone was moving just out of sight. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the damp ground. The car stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then the whispers started again, louder this time. They were coming from behind me. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The back seat was still empty, but in the rear-view mirror, I saw a figure standing in the distance. It was just a silhouette, shrouded in darkness, but it was unmistakably human. I froze, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It just stood there, watching. I pressed the gas pedal, desperate to get out of there. The car lurched forward, and I forced myself to focus on the road ahead. But no matter how fast I drove, the tunnel stretched on endlessly, the exit nowhere in sight. The whispers grew louder, angrier, and the shadows on the walls seemed to multiply, darting and writhing like living things. Then the car stalled. The engine sputtered and died, the lights flickering before plunging me into total darkness. I tried to restart it, but the ignition clicked uselessly. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with the keys, my fingers trembling. In the rearview mirror, the figure was closer. It was walking toward me now, its movements slow and deliberate. The closer it came, the more details I could make out. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its limbs seemed too long, bending in ways that didn't make sense. I turned the key again, my heart hammering in my chest. The engine roared to life, and the headlights flooded the tunnel. The figure was gone. I didn't waste any time. I floored the gas pedal, the car jerking forward as I sped through the darkness. The whispers faded behind me, replaced by the sound of my own ragged breathing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the faint glow of moonlight ahead. The tunnel spat me out onto an empty mountain road, the fresh air hitting me like a wave. I didn't stop driving until I reached a nearby town, where I parked outside a diner and sat there, shaking. When I glanced at my watch, my stomach dropped. It was 4:13 a.m. I'd entered the tunnel at 11:30 p.m. There was no way I'd been driving for nearly 5 hours. The next day I asked a local about the tunnel. His face paled, and he shook his head. "That tunnel's been closed for years," he said. "Collapsed a long time ago. Ain't no one driven through it since." I didn't argue. I didn't even tell him what happened. I just nodded and left, vowing never to take a shortcut again. Supposed to be a quick shortcut turned into the longest night of my life. I was running late, and I hate running late. The sun was already setting, and I still had hours to go. My GPS chirped at me cheerfully, offering a shortcut through a forested route I'd never taken before. It promised to shave 30 minutes off my drive, and at the time, saving 30 minutes felt like a lifeline. At first, the road seemed perfectly fine, a narrow but well-maintained strip of pavement winding through tall trees. The golden light of dusk filtered through the canopy, painting everything in soft oranges and yellows. It was quiet, peaceful even, with no other cars in sight. But about 10 minutes in, the road began to change. The pavement gave way to gravel, and the gravel quickly turned to dirt. The trees, once inviting, now loomed closer to the road, their branches arching over the path like skeletal fingers. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me, as if trying to swallow the road entirely. That's when I noticed the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was an oppressive, unnatural stillness. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing but the crunch of my tires on the dirt. It felt like even the wind had stopped. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I glanced in the rearview mirror and my stomach dropped. The road behind me was already swallowed by shadows. The further I drove, the narrower the road became. What had started as a decent trail now felt like a forgotten path, overgrown with weeds and littered with branches. I slowed down, gripping the wheel tightly as the car jolted over the uneven ground. That's when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I glanced around, peering into the darkening woods, but saw nothing. Still, the feeling lingered. prickling the back of my neck like an itch I couldn't scratch. A shadow darted across the corner of my vision, quick and fluid. I whipped my head toward it, but whatever it was had already disappeared behind the trees. I pressed on, the unease growing with every mile. My GPS had long since lost its signal, the little dot on the screen frozen in place. I was completely alone, surrounded by towering trees and silence so thick it felt alive. Then, just ahead, I saw something, or someone. A figure stood on the side of the road, partially obscured by the trees. At first, I thought it was a person, but something about the way it moved didn't seem right. It was subtle, a slight tilt of the head, a slow, jerky turn as it looked in my direction. I couldn't make out any details, just the pale outline of a face and two glowing eyes reflecting my headlights. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart raced as I kept driving, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn around. But the road had become so narrow that reversing was nearly impossible, and besides, I had no idea where it would lead. Suddenly, the car sputtered and came to a halt. I stared at the dashboard in disbelief, the engine light blinking accusingly. I turned the key in the ignition, but the car only whined in protest. "Come on," I muttered, trying again. Still nothing. I stepped out into the cold night air, the flashlight from my glove compartment, my only source of light. The forest was pitch black, the trees towering like silent sentinels. I popped the hood and shone the beam of light over the engine, though I had no idea what I was looking for. My breath fogged in the air as I leaned closer, trying to calm the rising panic in my chest. Then I heard it. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, circling the car like a predator stalking its prey. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. I swung the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw them. Pale faces, peeking out from behind the trees. There were at least 3 of them, their features unnervingly blank, their wide eyes unblinking. "Who's there?" I demanded, though my voice cracked. They didn't respond, they didn't move, they just watched. My hands shook as I backed toward the car, fumbling to close the hood. The footsteps started again, quicker this time, closing the distance. I barely made it into the driver's seat before one of them lunged. The figure slammed into the car, its face pressed against the window. Its features were distorted, too pale and impossibly smooth, like a mannequin brought to life. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin as it peered inside. I locked the doors and turned the key again, desperation clawing at my throat. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas. The figures scattered, but their eyes stayed fixed on me as I sped down the road, the headlights bouncing over the uneven ground. The road seemed endless, twisting and turning through the dense forest. The trees blurred together in a dark haze as my speedometer climbed higher. Then, without warning, the path widened, and I burst out onto a paved highway. The sudden smoothness of the road was jarring, and I had to slam on the brakes to keep from veering off course. I pulled over to the side, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, the events of the last hour crashing over me like a tidal wave. But when I checked the clock on the dashboard, my stomach dropped. It was nearly dawn. I had entered the shortcut around 8 p.m. There was no way that much time had passed. Later that day, I stopped at a diner to gather my thoughts. The waitress noticed my disheveled state and asked if I was okay. I told her about the shortcut, hoping she could shed some light on what had happened. Her face paled as she shook her head. "There's no road through that part of the forest," she said. "Not anymore. It was shut down years ago. Too many accidents." I didn't argue. I didn't even tell her what I saw. I just nodded, paid my bill, and left, vowing never to take a shortcut again. But the memory stayed with me. And sometimes, late at night, I catch myself glancing out the window, half expecting to see those pale faces watching me from the trees.